Good evening. Oh, can everybody hear me? Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us at Lighthouse Books. And we are among the foliage, as you can see, very among the flowers, which is perfect for the launch of The Ophelia Girls by Jane Healey. Look at this miraculous cover. I am so delighted to talk to Jane in this almost perfect setting for this book that is a very summer book. And the title of this panel is The Power and Perils of Being a Young Woman. And I'm Catalina Watt. I am an author and literature officer at Creative Scotland. So yeah, let's just get started. I will introduce Jane for those of you who don't know her. You should. So Jane Healey studied English literature at the University of Warwick. She was shortlisted for the 2013 Bristol Short Story Prize, the 2014 Costa Short Story Award, the 2016 Commonwealth Short Story Prize, and the 2017 Penguin Random House Right Now Mentoring Programme. So The Ophelia Girls is her second novel, and her first is The Animals at Lockwood Manor, which was published in 2020 and won the HWA Debut Crown Award. Amazing. Yes, welcome, Jane. So I thought that we would start with some general questions about the book, because it is fresh, hot off the press. So I'm assuming that not everyone here has necessarily had the chance to read it yet, but hopefully after tonight they will dive right in. So I wanted to start by asking you, what were your main inspirations for this book?
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. I think, well, I just became quite obsessed with the figure of Ophelia and the way there were so many self-portraits of women and girls as Ophelia, often in like bathtubs or like rivers or pools. Just since I was a teen, I've just been kind of followed by these images and seen them across like the internet and every kind of image sharing site. And I was really interested what the impulse was behind that to pose as beautiful and dying. And I think it kind of stems from there. And also memories of, like, I grew up in the countryside, in the fields, and there's a wood and there's a river, and just memories of summers there and how, like, hot they were and how I was like a sullen, bored teen. And, so
Perfect. Yeah, I think we can all relate to the hot weather kind of bringing out certain parts of our personalities. And I just wanted to ask you, do you have a favourite Ophelia? Because as you say, she's been portrayed so many times. And is there one that stands out to you specifically?
I like the photographs. I like the self-portraits. I really like just the intimacy of them. And I mean, I love the paint. Like the Millet painting is probably like my favorite painting. But I love the photos. I find them so mesmerizing.
Yeah. And photography comes up a lot in this book, particularly as an art form. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And I wanted to ask you, the acknowledgements in this book say that the novel lived in your head for 15 years in some form. And I was so fascinated by that. And I wondered if you could talk about kind of how it changed in that time.
I had the image of, this dual narrative is part set in 1973 and part in 1997. And in 1973, it's about 5 teenage girls who spend their summer at a river near a grand house, taking portraits of themselves with Polaroid and a camera until tragedy occurs at the end of the summer. And then it's the daughter of one of those girls later in 97. And I think my inspiration was that, I just had an image of like these girls posing as Ophelia in the river. And I just didn't really know what to do with it. I thought, I want to write a story. I'm not sure. Like the first attempts, I had them as a kind of group voice. But then I didn't really know where to go with them.
Right.
And I had another image of a photographer taking photos of a teen girl in the field, kind of above the woods. And I wasn't quite sure how to marry the two. And then I realized that she could be the daughter, and it could be years later. But the one sticking point was I wasn't sure. So Maeve is the teenage daughter in 1997. I wasn't sure why we would be interested in her.
Yeah.
I thought, well, there has to be some kind of hook, or she can't just be. There has to be like some sympathy there, and some like deeper themic weight. And then when I realised that her character could have been recovering, so she spent her childhood in hospital with leukemia and then complications after a bone marrow transplant and pneumonia. And I really liked that connection of her having being kind of ill and sickly with the figure of Ophelia, and also Elizabeth Siddal, who was the model for Millet's painting, infamously got pneumonia posing for him. And so I thought that was like the idea of she's 17 at the start, kind of emerging out of a childhood of being sick and being cared for, but also almost dying, and what happens when you reach adulthood and your parents or the adults around you are telling you, well, now you get to be free, you get to be in charge, you get to go out into the world. But she doesn't feel ready for that. She feels like she's lost years, and that living is difficult for her, I guess. And it's that kind of that connection to Ophelia, because she's had that near death.
That's amazing. I think this might be a good time. You've kind of whet everyone's appetite, I think. So if we could just have a short reading, and I think you're going to start us at the very beginning and introduce us to our main character.
Yeah, so I'm going to read the prologue. This is in the point of view of Ruth, who is the mother, Maeve's daughter. That summer of 73, they called us the Ophelia Girls because we dressed up like Shakespeare's ill-fated heroine, or our own teenage versions of her, in silk slips from jumble sales and long floral dresses. We ran up with our mother's sewing machines and laid out in the frigid waters of the river in the woods, taking turns to stand on the mossy bank and take photos of each other, looking beautiful and tragic. We liked the way we looked and the way we felt in the water, our bodies held up and cradled, skin sharp with the cold, the stones under our backs shifting with the current. We would take the deepest section of the river, sometimes wade over to help each other into the right positions or to plait hair, rearrange the way our dresses lay to make us look as beautiful as possible. Sometimes we would sink a little further under the surface until the lip of the water met over the end of our noses and hold our breaths until our cheeks ached. Eyes open or closed, arms curled or stretched, we left our platform shoes, our sandals on the riverbank. We were 15, 16, 17 then, and our families were summering at the cottages in the hamlet on the hill above the woods in the English countryside. Our parents had been bemused at first with our obsession, the armfuls of flowers we picked or stole from gardens, begged from the startled boy working at the florist, the outfits we sewed feverishly into the night, the damp clothes left in heaps on our floors. But then they grew concerned. We were obsessed, they said, foolish, even hysterical. We laughed at them, at the name they had given us, when we tripped up through the fields after dark, with our blue knees and shivering coltish limbs, our sodden dresses leaving a sticky trail behind us in the dry grass, petals crushed underfoot. We smiled when we huddled together under the shade of a tree to open the packets of developed photographs, or watch our bodies bud and bloom on Polaroids held in sweating hands. We quivered with a giddy kind of joy when we lay out in the river, our dresses waterborne, lace and satin and polyester moulding to our skin, rings tugged loose by the gentle current, hair like reeds, flowers slipping from our grasp and floating downstream. I have run from that summer, tried to forget its hazy pleasures and its tragedies, how it ended, how things fell apart. I have trusted the years to fade my memories and destroyed those photographs, never to be looked at again. But now, 24 years later, back in my childhood home, in that same hamlet above the woods, and now a mother myself, the memories keep returning, like driftwood washed ashore. And though I have never since walked far enough through the woods to reach the river, nor stood on its placid banks while the willow trees whisper in the breeze above me, each night I find myself waking, gasping for air as if I am breaching its surface, remembering the tug of the waters on my limbs and the loamy smell that lingered for hours afterwards, my chest slicked with a sweat that chills me to the bone.
We can all give Jane a round of applause for that. This is so lovely, being able to have a hybrid event where we can have an audience in front of us to hear this reading. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I think a great part to kick off with is this idea of memory. And that comes up in the prologue, but it comes up kind of threaded throughout the whole book with the dual timelines and the dual perspectives. And I kind of wanted to ask you, what were you hoping to explore with this idea of memory versus reality, and the idea that your memories can change over time, but then you might have a revelation about something and it changes the way you remember it. Does that make sense?
I think I was interested in exploring trauma. I think my first novel was about that too.
Yeah.
And that's why I really like a dual time narrative, because things reemerge, and I'm interested in the way trauma loops and circles and repeats and reemerges. Obviously with like Ruth and Maeve, they both have they're both getting photographed as Ophelia. And there's a point later on where Ruth kind of starts to, I suppose, lose her mind a bit, and she sees her daughter from the corner of her eye, and she thinks it's herself. And I was really interested I like Gothic doubles and Gothic triples, and mirroring and repetition, and also the idea of the house. Ruth kind of, so at the start of the book, Ruth returns to this house, her childhood home, after her father died, and she hasn't lived there since she was a teen. So when she's wondering, when she's kind of trapped in the house, she's looking after her younger children, who are 6-year-old twins. She's trapped in the house in a role of mother, remembering her time as a teen and how free she felt then, how trapped, and the same, and being in these same rooms that she was, and remembering her father, who is kind of a figure that looms over the novel. And I think I don't know, I feel like I connect water with memory a lot. The idea of, well, I think I said it in a prologue, the idea of stuff like washing ashore, or and the idea of a stream, kind of, they have this, so the girls in the 1973, they had this bucolic kind of summer, this sisterhood, where they can be free in the river, like away from the eyes of the teen boys, away from their parents and society, and they but the river has to come from somewhere and go somewhere, so it's not a pool isolated. And we find out later that the outside world has already kind of encroached among the girls.
But that's something they don't really consider, right? They kind of consider the river their sanctuary. And I thought it was really interesting that in the kind of the present 97 timeline, Ruth does eventually go back to the river, and she talks about it being much lower than she remembers. And, you know, she talks about, were we actually as submerged as we thought, or were we actually swimming with like the rocks against our knees? And I just thought that was so fascinating, that the landscape changes as well, not just in her memory is fragile, and she's sort of like, was it like this back then, but has it also changed? I suppose it's that thing of when you're a child and you go back to a place and you're like, have I got bigger, or has it got smaller, or is it a combination of both?
And like with her trauma and her memories, she's kind of never really left the river.
Absolutely.
It has haunted her, and the imagery of it has kind of stayed with her. There's I don't really want to spoil other bits.
This is a very difficult book to talk about without spoiling things, but we'll try our best. I want to pick up on your point about kind of Gothic doubles, and you know, in the prologue it talks about burning the photographs, trying to erase the memory of these events. But obviously Ruth carries that with her throughout the rest of her life, and then I suppose being back in that space reawakens a lot of things for her. And you mentioned kind of Ruth and Maeve look quite similar. Obviously Ruth in the present day has taken some pains to change her appearance, because she doesn't like certain, I think, connotations that people have, because she dyes her hair, is that right? So she's naturally a redhead, and so is Maeve.
And just cuts her. I just didn't. I felt like, because she had like kind of long red hair, looked like that classic Millet painting. Didn't want to be reminded of that.
And she doesn't want to be reminded of that, because when she sees Maeve and thinks it's her younger self, that's a really like horror moment, where she's sort of, she thinks she's seen the ghost of her former self, which I thought was so fascinating, because the idea of identity and defining yourself, but also other people defining you, comes up a lot in this novel. Do you want to talk a bit about how you wanted to explore that?
I don't know where to start. Just really interested in like the inner life versus the outside life. When I write, I'm very inside the character. I don't know, like Maeve and Ruth, I don't know what their faces look like. I know what the other characters' faces look like, but I can't ever picture them, because I'm always like in their skin. It's always very tactile. Yeah, talking about our life. A photograph, and the idea of being pinned down by a photograph, and memories, and there's so many images, people making images in the novel. There's people taking photographs, there's people drawing, there's and I suppose just the power of those images and what they can mean to different people, and really interested in the muse artist relationship to the girl, because the girls are kind of both muse and artist for each other. Absolutely. They kind of slip into the boundaries between them, that muse and artist. So,
that's sort of different for some of the characters, where there's a more clear delineation between the artist and the muse, right? So with the girls in 73, they're sort of a collective, and they all take photos of each other, and they all sort of take turns at playing Ophelia and playing other almost tragic heroines. But then in the modern day, I wonder if you could, this is probably a difficult question without spoiling things, but I was wondering if you could talk a bit about Maeve and Stuart, because Stuart is a photographer and Maeve is almost his muse in a way, I think, versus Ruth, who is both the subject and the artist as a teen, but also as a mother. She has put away her drawings and then she brings them back out again.
And she draws Stuart, and it's all this.
It's very
loops and
exactly.
Repetition and uses artists. I guess it's that idea that Stuart's trying to kind of capture Maeve's youth, and is there something malicious about that? And he has this project where he wants to remake kind of classic paintings as photos. He's an ex-war photographer, so he knew Ruth as a child, and he was there that summer of 73. So you're aware that is he connected to it, and then he leaves them, becomes a war photographer, and then just returns. He returned for the father's funeral, and they invited him to stay. Bad idea. And so he's doing this project, and he was there. The 73, he knew what the girls were doing, and now he's doing the same kind of project, but it's just him and Maeve, and there's a different power dynamic there, and it's I just found it really interesting to compare and contrast the two.
And all the characters are watched by each other, even if they don't know they are. There's the photography element, but also in terms of they're all living in this house. It's very claustrophobic. I think some of us might be able to relate to this in kind of the past year of not having a moment where your privacy really feels like yours anymore. And I think that's particularly true for Maeve, because she's a teenage girl. That's obviously a time where you want a lot of privacy, and she hasn't really had that, because she's had this quite different childhood where she's been sick. She's been monitored a lot more closely than she might have been.
It's the space of that house, and then it kind of starts in the house, and then May ventures to the walled garden, and then she's out in the field, and then there's woods and the river are waiting there. So it's and there's the long grass in the meadow where she's kind of hidden, and it's all about that movement, I guess, from the like closed dark bedroom, her room, to and Stuart staying in a little like annex across the way.
It's almost like domesticated and then wild spaces, because in 73 the girls kind of talk about wanting to just start their own commune and almost run away to the river, even though that's not necessarily possible or practical. So much to unpack with this book. I guess probably related to this is this idea of the male gaze versus the female gaze, because we have a very tight cast of characters here, and I think it's really fascinating that all the characters are kind of observing each other. There's a level of almost surveillance, but the way people look at each other, and I'm particularly thinking of Stuart as a man, and he's an older man, taking photographs of this teenage girl, and the inherent power dynamic that is there, and the very messy dynamics that start to develop between them. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about what you were hoping to just to kind of explore with this idea of, does it matter who's behind the camera? Does that make a difference?
I'm not sure. I feel like I kind of go into that a bit in the epilogue, so really
you're just going to have to read it, people. I think it's so fascinating, though, because it's this idea, again, of almost reclaiming your identity, exploring that and finding that, and being defined by yourself rather than society. And I wanted to ask you why you chose to set it in the 70s and then in the 90s, and if there were specific kind of societal developments that you thought were interesting throughout that time shift.
I did think saying in the 70s is that second wave of feminism, that idea of kind of sisterhood, and but also it was practically because I wanted to set in 97 because I remember that summer, and I remember how hot it was, and then all the stuff happening, Labour getting in, and in the end Princess Diana dying, and that was a heat wave. I wanted to set it in a heat wave, so then I had to be like, right, I need several years, I need to put Ruth somewhere, and then the 70s really worked out, I think, for the for that countercultural movement, and so the girls in the 70s, their parents are all teachers staying in the hamlet, and they kind of the parents kind of give up their responsibilities. It all gets a bit
it almost becomes a commune in a way, because there's a lot of free love happening, and the parents are drinking a lot, the teenagers are drinking a lot. There's a lot of just a lot of tensions in the air, and I think that there's a lot of really fascinating stuff in this novel about gender, about sexuality, and about class, because Ruth is sort of from, I suppose, a more middle class background, whereas some of the other people, they're staying there for the summer, and Stuart is working class. Stuart's father worked as the gardener for kind of the hamlet, so I wanted to do that classic, son of the groundskeeper, like it's a good trope, comes in and like messes stuff up and reveals the cracks. And one of Stuart's projects, it's called like British Ruins or something. He's a bit pretentious, and he goes around to stately homes and takes photos of the owners with kind of a large format camera, and then the staff behind the scenes in the same camera. So and Ruth's father was a lawyer, and he was mentoring Stuart at the time, so he was Stuart was kind of a like a son figure. It's quite Freudian. I don't enjoy Freud, and yet these novels keep ending up Freudian, so I'm sorry about that. There's a lot of, like, I suppose, incestuous undertones, and like just interested in archetypes and in inheritance of like trauma, and I suppose the mothers, because a lot of it's about mother and daughter relationship, Ruth and Maeve. And the idea that Ruth looks at Maeve and sees her kind of lost potential, sees who she could have been, and kind of almost judges herself through Maeve's eyes. Absolutely.
And also, so in the 1970 storyline, Ruth becomes enamored with a girl called Camille, and so a lot of the storylines about her falling in love, and then being haunted by her later. And there's another double, I suppose, because she looks at Maeve, who's kind of vulnerable, and thinks of Camille. And there's I think Camille is a really fascinating character. I'd kind of love to talk about her, because she doesn't appear very often, but when she speaks, she really makes an impression, I think, on the reader. And she has this amazing speech about Ophelia, when some of the other boys, so this is in 1973, and some of the other boys think it's, what they're doing is kind of stupid, and it's really childish, I think, and they don't really understand what it's for, because the boys aren't allowed to be involved in it, and I think they take that quite badly. So she kind of she gives this great speech where she almost tells them off and says that Ophelia is not she's not helpless, like she has this power. She kind of I think the quote is like, she ruptures the story of Hamlet, and they, the other characters feel ashamed when they look at her, because she's the embodiment of all the things that they've done, I can't remember who. I mean, obviously the figure of Ophelia is kind of like echoed down the years, and I can't remember who the theorist is, but they said that Ophelia in Hamlet doesn't really have her own story. Her own story is the story of her representation through time. So how Victorian ideas of hysteria were often connected with the figure of Ophelia, and photographs, when they photographed women in insane asylums kind of dressed in the white dresses and the weeds like Ophelia. So there's this connection, and then how on stage the figure of Ophelia has changed, and through different adaptations and different ideas.
There's so much to unpack with the kind of the gender expectations, like Camille talks about preferring kind of older stories, because they're kind of more romantic and mystical, but then as you say, they're on this cusp of kind of social change, but then they're almost harking back for something that doesn't quite exist because it's this fictional portrayal of like tragic femininity. But
yeah, I guess I was interested in finding all these photographs of it just seemed like on Flickr, and then obviously now on Instagram and like TikTok, and I found that it seems to be a lot like the first photo shoot a lot of girls did was posing as Ophelia. Like it was an easy scene to kind of do. Yeah. You've got a bath, you get flowers, or you go down to the river, but they're posing as a figure from a painting by a man.
Yeah.
And so what does it mean for them to be, and as the girls in the 70s, what does it mean for them? Their self-expression is this figure of Ophelia, but it's from a play by a man, it's from a painting. So I guess there's that idea of, I suppose that the male gaze, the female gaze, and female self-expression, how do they do it within a language and a world of men?
Absolutely.
And I think there's probably some like water women imagery stuff going on there.
Yeah.
And like queer water feminism. I don't know.
Yeah, that's pretty much the symbolism throughout. You've captured it. Yes. I also wanted to kind of ask you. You touched a bit on it with Ophelia being this kind of this tragic figure, and obviously, sorry, spoilers for Hamlet, but she dies. Everybody dies in the named play. If it's the character title in a Shakespeare play, they will probably all die. So kind of death and decay come up a lot in this book because it's set in summer. Summer is obviously the height of life, as we can see, but then all things must die, and the cyclical nature of nature. But and obviously Maeve has come so close to death, and she's seen her own body, break down and decay. And there's a sort of morbid curiosity, I think, with these characters where they're sort of skirting death, they're brushing with it, and it's kind of ever present, but almost people don't want to talk about it, which is understandable.
Well, I was just interested in that Ophelia, because it's kind of the photograph of them. Is it her at the moment of drowning, or is it her just before? And the idea that the girls keep repeating this, but they never really think about, her dying. They just think, well, this is a beautiful image, like an icon.
Absolutely.
And with I was just really interested in Maeve. Like, what do you do after that you realise how fragile her body is?
Yeah. She's reclaiming herself in her truest sense of physicality and rebelling against her parents, who they don't quite know how to interact with her, I think, at this stage, because her parents also have quite a fraught marriage at this point, and I think that there's a lot of guilt and resentment and blame about how they both handled that period of her being really sick. And
I think Maeve says at one point that her getting sick was like a bomb going off in her family, because her mother always had to be with her at the hospital, and then she had these two younger siblings, and then one of the younger siblings donated their bone marrow. And I did a little bit of research into that. I found that really interesting, because he would have been like 4 at the time. Yeah. And the ethical argument is that it's more damaging for a young child to lose a sibling than to go through like an operation like that. Yeah. But Ruth, the mother, obviously holds guilt for that.
For sure.
And Maeve does too, because I guess there's something a bit vampiric, about that. Yeah.
And this idea of like how much can a 4-year-old really understand the implications of what they're agreeing to. And I think that I can't imagine how difficult a situation that would be for a family, and the fact that they managed to somewhat get through it. And then there's a lot to deal with after the fact.
But what you're saying about decay, there's a lot of like the girls collect flowers and they preserve them, hence all the flowers here, and they preserve them between like pages of books, and they make like flower crowns and daisy chains, and that idea of like trying to preserve these kind of fragile blooms. And then the photograph, the idea of photographs fading and being lost or being rediscovered. I was really interested in that as kind of like a moment, I suppose. Many times, like there are quite a lot of different photographs and different images, and there's kind of
they sometimes can't tell each other apart as well. Ruth talks about looking back and being like, was this me? I'm not sure, like who, because they all kind of share clothing, and they almost are one body, one collective at that point, where they're all just embodying Ophelia in different ways. And so she's looking at herself sometimes and not quite recognizing her past self, which I thought was so fascinating. I kind of wanted to ask you a bit about the dynamic between Ruth and Stuart and Ruth's father, because I think that's I think what comes up a lot in this book is the idea of relationships not quite being how you perceive it when you're on the outside, and you think you look at a dynamic between two people and you understand it, but actually if you're in it, it might look very different. Yeah.
I don't know quite how to talk about that without spoiling.
Yeah. Because he's quite austere, and I think when Ruth is younger, she because Ruth grows up just with her father and a housekeeper, and so it's a very, I think, quite an antiquated, very very specific and strange dynamic.
Kind of an old fashioned. They're in a Victorian house, and it's almost a Victorian.
Doesn't feel like the 70s. It feels older.
And then there's the girls at the river who are very much of their time.
Yeah.
I think I was just interested in him being a surrogate son, and then Ruth's kind of competitiveness with that, her envy, and Stuart. Stuart is enamored by Ruth in the past, and then when he arrives, he finds Maeve, who looks very much like the mother, and
it's all just excellent from that.
And then,
I think it's really fascinating because Ruth in the past is quite tomboyish. She dresses quite masculine, and her father, he obviously kind of has these ideas of womanhood and what she should represent. And again, this kind of doubling with mothers and daughters. She looks quite similar to her mother, who he still is in pain at losing, but they have that grief kind of sits between them, and so they never really speak about this ghost that kind of is in their house. But Ruth finds her mother's old clothes in the attic, and then puts it on and puts on the kind of like silk nightgown to then take photos of herself drowning. It's so fascinating with that, because it's this idea of technically her mother's things would belong to her, but her father feels really possessive of them still, and it's almost like he's trapped in a past that he won't let go. And I thought it was really fascinating that he had all these ideas and expectations for her life, but he didn't really communicate with her. He was just sort of like, you'll go off and do these things and become this embodiment of femininity according to him, according to his very old school traditions. And I think that there's a lot of stuff that comes out later about you might be moving with a society, but you're not quite ready to accept that things have changed, and that it would be okay for you to be more at peace with yourself. I think there's a lot of repression. Everybody needs a lot of therapy, I think, and to talk to each other a lot more.
I mean, Ruth's storyline is very much about kind of this queer relationship, kind of almost relationship she had in the past, and then her repressing that later on. She's married, she's got children, and that reemerges in dramatic fashion.
She's so desperate to fit into this particular mold that I think other people want her to be, but her true self keeps coming out, and she keeps trying to push it back, which I thought was so fascinating. But I think it's this idea that you have to make peace with yourself at some point. You can be in denial, but at what cost? What shape will your life take if you're not being your truest and happiest self?
And Stuart as a character is very tied. I mean, we don't hear from his point of view. It's just Ruth and Maeve, but his motivations come through, and it's him. He's also kind of trapped and leashed to this past because he was the surrogate son. He was being mentored to be a lawyer, and then suddenly all Ruth knows is that after university he left the country, he left them, he never contacted them again, and then he reappears. So we find out more about his relationship with the family and what happened. And I think so when I first started writing it, I wrote him as like a straight villain. I was like, he's coming in, he's kind of preying on Maeve, and maybe I should let the reader think that there's almost something violent. He's a war photographer, he's had a difficult childhood. Is there something, should there be a threat of violence there? And then I realized there didn't really need to be that. And also my editors kind of pushed me to make him more complicated. And the more I wrote, the more you're inside a character, it's very difficult to write them as black and white.
For sure.
I found him a really interesting as a character, what he gives away, what he doesn't, what his motivations are, his relationship to his family, and then to Maeve. I just didn't want him to be. I didn't want that threat there of violence.
I think there's a lot of almost external threat that comes to certain characters in this book, and I think it's more true to make a character complicated, because I think people don't think that they are the villains in their own stories, and it's almost sadder when you kind of empathize for somebody who does things that you might not agree with or have questionable motives. But I think that human element is what makes it more powerful when those things happen.
I was really interested. So the Maeve's storyline Ruth's storyline, I guess, is half her remembering the 70s and half as she is currently kind of remembering it. And Maeve's is very linear. It starts with her meeting Stuart and kind of continues on to the end of the summer. Her chapters are very easy to write. They flowed. And I was really interested in this kind of a dual register. It's third person, so I was able to get some distance, but there's her romanticism about Stuart, and then there's the reader's knowledge of a kind of grooming, and then the reality is somewhere in between. And they meet as characters. They're both romantics. They talk about stories a lot. It's a lot. He gets to depose his characters from stories, and he talks about the stories from his youth, of like picturing himself in like the big house, and that was just really interesting to write both layers right there from the beginning. I think I never really wanted to write Stuart as one kind of character and then do a sudden like, oh no, he's actually a predator. Like, I kind of wanted that always there from the beginning. You always know that there's this connection, and you kind of know which direction it's heading in.
It's so well seeded, because it's like you can see what's happening, and I found myself really feeling for all the characters, even when they make quite questionable decisions. I think that there's definitely this move towards. I think there are a lot of narratives around older men and younger women, and the power dynamics that can come with that, and sometimes it can fall on one side of the spectrum or the other, where it's like there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. It's a perfectly healthy, functional relationship, versus the big bad wolf is coming for Red Riding Hood. But
I think so. Part of the reason. I think part of the inspiration was I was frustrated with some coming of age stories where there was a relationship like that, but it was almost like I've read a few novels and things where there's a teen girl, often like on a holiday with the parents, and that kind of literary novel where there's like a friend of the family, and then she starts expressing her sexuality, and then there's almost like a really like cruel encounter, and then in the second half of the novel she's kind of like bruised, but is now kind of a woman, and then the last third she finds a boy her age, and it's all like and reunites with the mother, and that just really frustrated me. I think one, because sometimes it felt almost like that male character, that encounter was a punishment for her for expressing and almost saying, oh, you're naive, and so therefore this you're going to get taken advantage in this unpleasant way, and also that idea that it was just like something like all girls had to go through, and it's just this kind of blip. But I was more interested in how a relationship like that kind of ruins a life, how it kind of just I suppose the power and the lingering effect of that, and that it's not a linear process of experiencing something formative in a good way or a bad way, and then just getting past it and then being your best self forever. Like I was interested in her desire. I was just interested in Maeve's desire. I wasn't interested really in like, yes, Stuart wants her. I feel like that's self-evident, but I don't need to describe kind of why he wants her, or I was just, and also when I wrote, I suppose the sex scenes, it's focused on her. I was just interested in her and her expression of her desire, and also where her desires come from, having been a patient, and
she has a lot of agency and a lot of power, which I think is really important, because sometimes teenage girls aren't written that way in books, and I think you really capture that kind of that naivety, because she is only of a certain age, and she's had an unusual childhood and maybe not had certain experiences, but then this idea of she's on this earth for longer than she thinks, and what does she want to do with that? Who does she want to be? And she's finally getting that chance to express it, and someone actually listens to her. Stuart says you don't listen to her, you don't look at her, you don't respect her, you just see her as who she was when she needed you to take care of her. And I thought that was really interesting, because there was this idea of like two Maeves, Maeve when she's sick and she needs her parents, and she kind of almost reverts to that childlike dependency, and then she's becoming a woman, she's on this cusp of womanhood, but those two images can't be reconciled for some of the characters. So I thought that was so well done. I think maybe this is a time for another short reading, and then I think we're just going to ask a few more questions. I'm just looking at Mary to check we're good for time, because I don't have a time device on me. Perfect, great. So yes, so I think we'll have a short reading and we'll have a few more questions, but we will be moving to an audience Q&A. Are we only taking questions from our physical audience or from our digital audience? Perfect, great. So so start getting your thinking caps on if you are here with us in physical or cyberspace. So yes.
So I'm going to read a passage from one of Maeve's chapters, her point of view. So it's near the beginning when Stuart's come to stay and she's waiting in the garden. Later, the rain has stopped and the sun is steaming it from the earth and from the leaves, drying the grass beneath Maeve's feet as she sits on a bench in the far corner of the garden next to the lavender bush, wanting to escape from the house and her twisting sadness. Branches of one of the apple trees outside the garden droop over the top of the crumbling brick, and fuchsia is bright at her side, its petals reminding her of the dress of the flower fairy in one of her favourite childhood books. If she slits her eyes open, she can see the whirl of the iron at the gate, and is thus perfectly positioned to see Stuart come into view, half an hour after she first sat down, pausing with his hand on the gate as he looks at her. Enjoying the sun, he asks. Yeah, the hand above her eyes, like it's him who is too bright to look at as he walks closer. How was your trip? Bit boring, he says with a shrug. He's standing in front of her now, throwing his shadow over her. How was your day? Bit boring, she shrugs, and he laughs. She wants to tell him about what she found, but doesn't know how to explain why silly childhood birthday cards made her feel so upset. Can I tell you a secret? He says, sitting next to her on the bench, setting his camera bag carefully down at his feet. Of course. I'd rather be working on my other project, not taking photos of boring rich people and their fancy houses. What project? He has the keys to the annex in his fist still, is wearing his usual belt and leather shoes, sunglasses hooked on the neck of his faded shirt, plain watch on his wrist, and a braided leather bracelet beside it. His wallet is peeking out of his pocket, and she sees the shape of his silver lighter in the other, assumes he has a pack of cigarettes in his back pocket as well. Maeve is wearing only a sundress. She likes the contrast between them, likes that he has so much stuff. He leans forward, rests his arms on his legs. I have this idea to remake old paintings in modern settings in photograph form, like those postcards I gave you, paintings that reference myths or cultural icons. I want to try and translate them into the modern world. He squints and looks up at her. Does that sound stupid? No, I think it sounds amazing. He smiles. I'm glad you approve. Will he ask to take her photo? Surely he will, she thinks. He told her she looked like Ophelia. He gave her those postcards. But maybe he has proper models in mind, willowy creatures without scars or round cheeks. Maybe he's just being nice to her, friendly like an adult to the daughter of his friend. Maybe she's an idiot. You're all right, he asks. I'm fine. He studies her like he doesn't believe her. Are you still in pain? He looks pained himself, as though it hurts him to think of her suffering, as though it's unimaginable and she loves him for it. No, I mean, there was some pain, but it was mostly exhaustion, bone-weary tiredness. I've never been seriously ill. I have scars. I've been injured, not sick, touch wood, and some of those injuries were my own fault. Like the time I bruised my spine and broke my wrist. What do you mean? He looks down and she notices the fan of his dark eyelashes. Oh, I was doing something stupid as usual. I was on assignment in Sarajevo during the siege, he says with a scrub of his fist through his hair. And I was just trying to observe the horror, the devastation of it all, neighbour becoming enemy, death arriving at the corner where your children used to play, dodging marksmen as you walk to the shops. I still have these dreams. He makes a sound in his throat and she touches his arm. She wants to be the one to reach him wherever he's gone. Anyway, he continues, catching her wrist gently and turning her arm as she tries not to make her own sound. I saw this shape in the street and I thought it was a young child. The others were trying to call me back, but I was feeling heroic and stupid, and I slipped on rubble and broke the bones here, he says, stroking across the thin skin of her inner wrist, making her stomach clench. For a moment, she feels the same queasy flush as she did when a gloved nurse searched for a vein, a zap going through her blood vessels, before he slides his grip to the base of her hand, before she breathes in the smell of his aftershave. He studies her palm. Her fingers have curled in, like the petals of a flower in a rainstorm. He brushes a fingertip along the inside of her index finger to straighten it out, a twitch of movement at the corner of his mouth. What happened to the child? She asks. Oh, it was only a coat or something, he says, meeting her eyes now and relaxing his grip on her wrist so that she has no choice but to take her arm back. I was an idiot. How can you be an idiot for trying to help someone? You're not meant to get involved as a photographer. You're meant to be an impartial observer. The keys in his other fist jostle. But we're not robots, you know. Everyone reaches their limit, he says, looking at her as the sun heats her legs to molten warmth, turns the top of her head hot like a halo, the flowers bright against the green around them, the grass tickling her feet.
If we could give Jane a round of applause. I just love that section. I think your imagery is just so beautiful, and I think the kind of juxtaposition between he's talking about like violence and death and all of this stuff, which I suppose in some way is quite titillating and exciting for this teenage girl who's had this quite cloistered life. But
I'm not quite sure. Someone asked me why Agent Wolf Topper. I'm not totally sure if there is any kind of. I mean, my memories of childhood. We watched a lot of news, and it was always war photographers and war and filmmakers on the TV, and that's like such a central part of my childhood. I feel like watching those reports and seeing those daring young men. And I read a really interesting book for research. I can't remember what it's called actually, but it's about the British photographers who went out there, and often they were like upper class. They went to Eton. There was this strange undercurrent. They were like these daring countercultural figures, but they had this and that's part and Stuart talks about that fact that he was kind of out of place even there. I suppose and also that idea of Maeve looks through one of Stuart's books of photos and she sees a figure and she doesn't know whether it's a dead figure, and the idea of him is I suppose is death beautiful, and what is an art and mortality and
the ethics behind capturing this. And he talks about being like an impartial viewer, and I think the idea of voyeurism comes up a lot in this. And what is your ethical obligation as somebody who sees something? Can you intervene? Should you intervene? And I think that's really fascinating, because he's made his career off documenting these atrocities. But I think he still hasn't hardened himself to it. He still feels affected by it, which maybe some people wouldn't. So maybe that shows that he's got some tenderness to him. He's got empathy, or maybe just bravado.
I think also the idea of class. There's like I feel like there's like a Marxist undercurrent in both my novels, where there's people in big houses, but should they have the big houses? I don't know, maybe not. And when he goes over to like war-torn places and meets people who are kind of ex-army or like officer class, and then there's all the interests of oil and the father in the novel, Alex, who we haven't talked about at all. Ruth's husband, Maeve's father, Alex, he works in chemicals, so there's that connection there. And then the idea of the because when Stuart was a boy, he wanted to be a human rights lawyer, but then he abandons that and documents war instead.
It's interesting you bring up Alex, because I think he's quite foundational to the running of the family, but he's almost outwith of the drama, because basically it's Alex, Stuart and Ruth were all quite close at uni, and there's this kind of joke of like, oh, was it like a love triangle?
But in an early draft there was a love triangle.
That's really interesting.
I can in an early draft I was like, and it's going to be like Alex and Ruth and Stuart, and they're going to have this triangle, and then like when he meets Maeve's going to be a mixture of like of both parents, and then it was like too messy.
I mean, I think that's so fascinating.
Yeah, the messy bisexual triangle square is in my next novel. So.
Oh, well, look out for that one.
I've moved it.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, because I think Alex is such a fascinating character, where again, like Stuart, he has a lot that's extremely frustrating as a reader and as a feminist. But I think, he works in chemicals, he works in London. There's so much interesting stuff, because it's the 90s, but I think we forget that like a lot has changed since then. And, he like takes the twins to the farm. He's like, oh, how long before we can go back? Like he's giving her a holiday from parenting their joint children. Like,
yeah, I guess it's that. So they both, Alex and Ruth, lived in London. They both worked. They had children,
and then she stopped working.
But then suddenly, after the father died, they returned to this house, and she didn't want to return there. Alex said, "You've inherited this house. We're going there, of course." But the house is kind of crumbling and expensive to run, and I was just, I love that imagery of like the windows are crumbling and they're going to break in, and there's damp everywhere.
Yes.
And there's like the cellar floods. And I think like early on when I thought about this novel, I pictured both like a really sunny, hot meadow when it's so sunny you can't even see.
Yeah.
And that kind of the sound and the dry grass walking through it. And also I pictured a girl walking through like a dark house, leaving wet footprints.
Yeah.
And that was what, because there's a dripping tap that Ruth hears on her first night.
Starts to drive her a bit.
Yeah. I just really like, and then when Stuart's visiting these other grand houses too and seeing their decay, and I love a Gothic house.
Yes. But Alex is so pragmatic about it. He's like, well, we'll just get the windows repaired, and he's thinking about it as like, it's a good escape for them and the children, and it's almost this rest cure for Maeve, and
like Ruth feels responsible for the house, so she's been left with the house and the children, and her husband now commutes, and she suddenly landed in a more traditional way of life, and the kind of metaphorical ghost of her father. It's not a real ghost in this one, not this one. Metaphorical ghost of her father is kind of there, and I just became obsessed with all these characters. I don't know, the experience of writing it felt really really magical.
It's a very small cast of characters, and I think we spend a lot of time with all of them, so I can understand that.
Especially Maeve. Her chapters just flowed, and I did very little editing on them. Ruth was more tricky. I found myself frustrated.
There's 2 versions of Ruth as well. We have to move between. So.
And I having to write all the girls in the 70s, I found that a bit intimidating. How do you write a cast? There's 5 of them. How do you write them all differently? How do you show them?
And that dynamic as well between all of them, and then how they are with each other versus as all 5 of them together. I thought that was I think a large cast of characters is quite a difficult thing to juggle, but it's really, I think the group of girls dynamic is very different from how they are one-on-one, particularly Ruth and Camille obviously are very different when they're alone versus when they're being perceived and almost performing for each other. Well, I'm aware of the time and also the topic of this panel, so I wanted to ask you, what do you think the power and perils of being a young woman are?
I didn't come up with that title.
I mean,
I don't know. I just wanted to focus on Maeve and Ruth in this moment of power and desire. They want things out of life. They want people, for sure. They want to be desired too. But there are forces around them threatening them.
You almost don't see it, I think, when you're younger as well. You feel kind of invincible. You feel like I could do anything I want. And I think, especially with women, there's this kind of pervasive narrative which I think can be really harmful about that you're at your full height, your full bloom when you're a young woman.
No, I was really into that with Ruth, like looking, the idea of like the teen girl as being the peak of beauty, and obviously, and Stuart kind of capturing that, and then the girls capturing that. The girls at the time in the 70s, they know there's this melancholy air because they think, this summer is it, we'll never be more beautiful than now, and so they try and capture it, but they're capturing themselves as a drowning girl. So there's an odd like darkness there right from the beginning,
because it's right before they go to university, both the summers for the so I think there is something about that that teenage kind of, you're maybe still living with parents or guardians, and you're about to embark on like the start of your adulthood,
and that like teenage death drive, I guess, where you don't know how vulnerable you are, and you take risks, and
Yeah, that's perfect. So I think we're going to move to some audience Q&A now. So hopefully you've had your thinking caps on. Mary, do we know if we're also taking digital questions?
Our online audience is being shy.
Okay, well maybe we'll start with some questions from our audience here, and that will kind of get them rolling. Does anybody want to start? Yes, I'll just.
Very particular literary tradition in a way, because I feel like it's a very repetitive sort of like idea in literature that summer and we should have sort of like lassitude, but also madness and freedom in a way. Skin exposed and he just sort of like triggered something inside people. Now sort of like how it came about, now it connects us to maybe the same sort of like literary tradition in a way.
You've just said so many interesting things.
I was just going to ask Mary, how do you want me to repeat the questions so that the digital
repeat a short version that can be heard?
Oh, how do I distill that down? So I think we're talking about this idea of like, was it summer and kind of like the extreme heat and how it triggers things in people and brings out certain things, and how that's a big part of the literary tradition is kind of, I can think of so many examples of like the summer where everything kind of comes to a head. Is that the
I think like when we were talking about death and decay, like a heat wave brings about death and decay, doesn't it? And I was really interested in the garden starts, dying, and there's the meadow and it's dry and sharp and painful for Maeve to walk through. And just that, I suppose, like I said at the beginning, I write from inside a body. I'm really interested in the bodily experience of a character. And I feel like that's why I probably wouldn't ever write kind of period, because I like historical eras, but eras where they're wearing a lot of clothes I struggle with, because I don't know, there's not a lot of skin, there's not a lot of touch, there's not a lot of I don't know, just the way a heat wave just knocks your body out, you can't think, you can't breathe. The idea of also with this, the imagery of like the water and the river, but then when it's so hot it almost feels like it catches your breath. And the idea of the light, I don't know, I have so many memories of like my childhood home was like this very dark farmhouse. So then in the summer I would walk out and the sun would hit you, that light in the summer, and you just feel like blinded. And then later on you go inside and it's cool and dark and your eyes take ages to adjust. I'm really interested in that contrast. And then like sleepless hot nights, but then sweating as well, the water, it's all imagery.
That's such a great question, thank you.
It's an amazing question.
Does anybody else have a question? Yes.
You mentioned Marxism was that theme that I was wondering if there are any other themes that type books together, and do you consciously think of the themes before you write the books, or do you find that they come out organically as you're in the writing process?
I'll just repeat the question for the digital audience. So the question was about Marxism and how that's come up in both your novels, and if there are any other themes that link the two of them. And sorry, I forgot the last part of your question. Was it, do you come up with the themes
beforehand, or do they emerge? I love like stately homes and like big houses, and I grew up in Kent, and every weekend my parents would take us to them. But my grandfather was like a Marxist, and my dad was raised in that tradition, and I just feel like that undercurrent, like I want to write about these big houses and opulence and like rich people shenanigans, what's going on. But then, and they have this grand house, and then maybe they don't keep the grand house. And I think some readers have maybe been disappointed in the first one, and maybe they might be in this one for that reason, because they like a big house, then it's inherited, and then like, oh, isn't this grand? But I can't write about one without writing that like decay and that undertone, and that other themes, trauma, and like that loop of like inheritance, and that comes out in the Gothic. Like I'm really interested in the Gothic as a genre, and other themes.
That links to the houses as well, because they're almost characters in their own right.
sometimes the themes emerge as I'm writing, and I just love that aspect of writing, the way themes emerge, the way characters change. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that there's probably like a drowning or an attempted drowning in a book about Ophelia. But I changed my mind a third of the way through, like who that was going to be, and I could like drastically change my mind.
This is like a mystery for the readers.
Flipped it completely, and that was I changed my mind because I was just writing. I was kind of writing away a chapter, and I like to end a chapter with like a little like image or like a darkness or like an intrigue, and I just wrote this little, and I was suddenly like, oh, hang on, this means this like one little image means it can't be this person, or it can, and the creative aspect of writing, I often start knowing the ending, maybe. I know a few scenes, I kind of write towards those scenes, but then things can change. And I really like the aspect of, I really like editing, the way you discover stuff from your own work. You like unearth it, you find threads where you take out things and then other things become clear, or you think, why do I keep using this image, or like this particular word choice, oh, that could mean this. And it's really, I really enjoy that process of like delving deeper into and finding what I have subconsciously put there, little things, and what they can mean.
Great. Hope that answers your question. I know, we're surrounded by crows, and it feels very atmospheric.
And it's getting cooler and cooler, darker.
Perfect. Does anybody else have a question? Yes. I'll just repeat the question. So we're talking about the character of Stuart, and originally he was a straight villain, and then adding layers of complexity, making him more grey and more nuanced without apologizing for the more creepy aspects of his behavior.
I just think that the more I think partly it was the connection to Ruth and the father. Like I found those scenes between Stuart and Ruth so fascinating to write. There's this great like undercurrent, and we're not quite sure what it is. And there's them in the past where he kind of was infatuated by her, and in the present, she's not quite sure. She hasn't talked to him. She hasn't known him since they were like at university, and then having him be the kind of the son of the groundskeeper there. There's sympathy there because there's this big grand house, and he has a violent father, and he works, and this is what he wants. And also, I just want to focus on Maeve and her desires, and she wants what he's offering, whether it's like healthy for her to want that, and like why she wants that. But I kind of wanted to give her that. That's what she wants. He's offering that. Like, what is the tragedy in that and the darkness? So there's hints about his motivations, but it was very much like the focus on her, and therefore I wasn't going to give her a villain to like. He's a villain, but I didn't want to kind of I just found him a fascinating character. What he gives away, what he doesn't.
He's a very good liar, and he admits that as well, which I think is so fascinating. Because if someone tells you they're a good liar, they're bringing you into that confidence, but then you don't know when they're lying to you if they're so good at it, which I think is, he uses it to sort of their advantage as well, to get Maeve things that she wants and is interested in exploring. And I think there's something quite thrilling about it, but I think there's that inherent thing where if when they are telling you truths and things that are very meaningful, can you trust that? And I think that's a very grey area.
And Ruth kind of had the power almost when they were young. She like he was infatuated with her, she wasn't really bothered. And then she draws him in the past because she wants to go to art school, and he says, "Oh, I'll be your model." And it's just he's written in, and then in the present, she thinks, "Oh, maybe I should pick up art again," and he models for her again. She draws him again, but the power dynamics completely changed in their relationship, and there's like the history, and so I think it was just writing more scenes with him and the mother, Ruth, that kind of connection that had to be kind of depth and interest in that. I hope that answers it a little bit.
Such excellent questions. Does anybody else have one? Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm. 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 So that was a question about what was it? How do I know?
I think it was about this idea of control and how maybe that's part of the male gaze, and that's part of both your novels, but with different characters and different dynamics. And I'm sorry, I forgot the last part of your question.
Well, I'm interested in the power dynamic of muse and artist and photographer. It's very, you pin the figure down in a photograph, and I think at one point they ask him about people he takes photos, because he started doing fashion photography.
Yes.
Now that he's back, and there's that idea of like, and he says, no, I have the power because I control, what images I develop and how these people appear in images. I'm trying to think. I was inspired by a lot of fashion photography.
Yeah.
For like, I read a lot of fashion magazines as a teen. And I just there was I think there's some Ophelia type images in that as well.
For sure.
Control. I'm trying to think of an answer.
I guess you need control to get a specific aesthetic. If you're a photographer and you're trying to capture something, you tell the model how, and he does this with Maeve. He tells her how to pose, and she kind of likes being told what to do, but she compares it a little bit to being told what to do by doctors and nurses. And,
I know there's that parallel
figures.
of like her as an object. That's what she thinks a lot about, how it was to be told what to do, but also cared for. And there's that dual idea of like, when she was in hospital, she was a body, and there were doctors and nurses kind of acting upon her, and she was kind of became used to that. She was kind of placid. She calls herself a perfect patient at one point, but then she was also cared for, and touched and held and monitored really closely. Her body was a thing to be monitored, and and her mother, Ruth thinks about that the way she used to be able to see on a monitor how her daughter was, but now that she's out of hospital and well, she doesn't know. A lot of the novels about Ruth worrying about Maeve and kind of dealing with the trauma of having a daughter who was ill and feeling guilty about that, and she can tell something's happening to Maeve in the summer, but she doesn't know what, and obviously she doesn't. The tension in the novel is when does she, and when does she find out what's happening with Stuart? He's come to stay with them,
but there's that thing where she's like Maeve is starting to rebel against the type of control that Ruth wants, and it's almost interesting because Ruth doesn't see necessarily what's right in front of her eyes, because she's so concerned with other aspects of Maeve's well-being that maybe she's a little bit blind to that. I hope that answers your question. Okay, does anybody else have anything they'd like to ask Jane? Oh yes, we have some in the back.
You already mentioned you're inspired by the Gothic genre, and you also hinted what you were maybe writing against in contemporary writing. And I was wondering if you drew on photography in any way, because it really feels like when we try to read it out, ranging pictures. So I'm wondering if there's any inspiration.
Yeah, that was a question about photography as an inspiration for writing and about setting a scene. Yeah, it's very visual. I saw all these scenes, and I guess again, it's like a lot about just the characters, what exactly they see, like a touch of a hand, or like looking at eyes, or like their focus, and then setting the scene almost in like a theatre way, especially Maeve and Stuart, because a lot of the scenes it's like a long seduction. So it's just all these little moments which that kind of like heightened when you're a teenager, and that sexual tension, I guess, and then also like every touch is magnified and made kind of notice it, because and then the reader also notices how he's made all these specific touches. So there's that double layer of like I think one of the reviewer said my novel was like a siren song, seduces as much as it disturbs, and I feel like I loved that, because there is this like it felt seductive to write, but it felt dark as well, and there's that kind of and it felt, I suppose, metaphorically like a drowning, or like something watery about it, and tragic. I think I love tragedy as a genre, so there's that kind of inevitability when Stuart and Maeve meet.
It is very it's very much an aesthetic. You kind of, all the players are set up, and then you're like, oh, we sort of know where this is going to go, but then it's kind of beautiful to watch it all kind of unravel.
And I liked setting it in the 2 summers, having that as the structure. The epilogue is set in a slightly different time. The epilogue is my favorite thing.
It's so good, but we can't talk about it.
I still remember I was walking around the meadows when I came up with part of it, and I still remember exactly where I was, and I was kind of like muttering it under my breath, trying to remember it, like hurry home to write it.
I think it's really interesting that you talk about how organic the process was, and that how the characters had such a strong presence in your mind, and I think maybe that's where the imagery being so strong comes from, is that they sort of lived with you and you really saw them.
But I guess like Stuart as photographer sees, analyzes stuff, watches stuff, but I feel like when you're a teenager you notice everything, and everything's like heightened, and every little moment, and Maeve's very aware of what she looks like in that kind of teenage thing, like, I've got the wrong clothes on, or like, what do I look like in a mirror? But then after Stuart's taken her first photo, she looks in the mirror and sees that she's been changed, and it's that she thinks she looks different now, so it's that idea of being seen, and then Ruth doesn't feel seen for who she is.
It's almost that validation from like an external viewer, and then like it's just that Maeve's view of
but how does that transform you, seeing an image of yourself? Does it trap you? Does it show you a new possibility?
Does it empower you? Great question. I think maybe we have time for a couple more. I'm looking at Mary.
I think we are out of time.
Gutted. We could talk for hours and hours, but
Jane's going to be signing, so if
anyone
wants to ask a question, they can come and ask it.
Yes. So I hope you all got that, but Jane will be signing books, and you can ask her your personalized questions then. So we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much to the digital audience for joining us, and our physical audience. If we could give Jane another round of applause.
Thank you all for coming. It's amazing. It's really nice. I launched my first novel here in like March of 2020. Interesting time, and like a week after that we went into lockdown, and it's like amazing. It's magical to be back here with like an audience, launching another novel during a pandemic, but bookshops are open now at least.
Yes, thank you Lighthouse Books for hosting us in their beautiful garden.
And thank you so much to Mary and Kathleen for this amazing launch. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone.